Texas, 1874. The dry wind carried the sound of boots and horses into the dust-choked auction yard outside Abilene. Rhetta Carrick's wrists were bound in coarse rope, her face streaked with dried blood and dirt, but her eyes stayed sharp. She had not cried since they dragged her from her home outside Sweetwater. She would not give them that. A man behind her yanked her forward onto the wooden platform. Next up, this one's young, strong, and knows how to keep her mouth shut. The crowd of men and traders laughed. She stared straight ahead. "Do I hear 500? The auctioneer barked. The men shouted over each other. Rhetta shut her eyes. She remembered the night 2 days ago. The men had come fast, masked on horses. Her father had been shot down in the doorway. Her mother's screams still echoed in her head. The fire had taken the rest. Now she stood here, 17 miles from where she had buried her parents with her bare hands. 700. 850, the bidding climbed. Rhetta tried to pull her hands free, but the rope cut deeper. A man leaned against the far fence, arms crossed, hat low over his eyes. He had not moved since the auction started. "Do I hear 9, going once, 1,000? The voice cut through the noise like a whip crack. The yard went still, all heads turned. The man at the fence stepped forward, dust kicked up around his boots. He was tall, broad-shouldered, sun-worn, with a rifle slung across his back. "Sir," the auctioneer stammered. "That's cash," the man said, tossing down a leather pouch. "Give her to me." The auctioneer caught it, weighed it, nodded. "Sold, to the gentleman in the hat." Rhetta blinked. The man stepped up onto the platform and cut the rope at her wrists with a hunting knife. He didn't say anything, just looked at her like he could see every bruise, every burn. Then he touched his hand to the brim of his hat. "Name's Vann Vexley. You're safe now." She stared at him, breathing hard. "Why?" His eyes didn't waver. "Because no one should be bought." He helped her down. The crowd parted. No one dared stop him. They rode out of Abilene fast, his horse carrying her in front of him, her hands shaking as they crossed the open plains. They did not speak until the sun dipped low. "I do not know you," she said quietly. "I know," he said, handing her a canteen. "But I know what it means to lose everything." She took a long drink. "They killed my parents." "I figured," he said. "Saw the ash on your dress." Silence again. He built a fire that night on the edge of a creek west of town. She sat close, arms wrapped around her knees. "You got anyone left?" he asked. "No," her voice cracked. "They burned it all." He nodded. "Then you ride with me until you decide different." She looked at him through the flames. "You paid $1,000 for a stranger." "I did." "Why?" He tossed a stick into the fire. "Because I could not ride past and sleep at night knowing I left you there." Her eyes searched his face. There was no lie in it. The next morning they rode toward his ranch near the Brazos River. It was not much, just a cabin, a barn, a corral, but it was quiet, safe. He showed her where the water pump was, where the flour was kept, told her she could sleep in the house, he would take the barn. She refused. "I do not want you to sleep out there. You bought my freedom, you will not be cold for it." "I will not touch you," he said calmly. "Not unless you ask me to." She stepped into the house and closed the door behind her. That night she crept back out and found him sitting on the porch. "I cannot sleep," she whispered. He looked up. "Me neither." She sat beside him. "Did you ever lose someone?" she asked. "My wife." "Years ago, fever took her." "Children?" "No, just me now," she nodded. "You do not talk much. No need to when the truth says enough." She looked at him, really looked. "You are not what I expected when you stepped onto that platform." "And what did you expect? A man who wanted to own me." He turned to face her. "I wanted to set you free." "And what now?" He leaned back against the post. "Now I wait and see what you want." She watched the stars. Her heart beat slower than it had in days. "I want to feel safe again." "You will." "I want to feel like myself." "You will." She met his eyes. "I want to know you." He gave the smallest nod. "Then we start there." And they did. Over the next week, Rhetta helped him mend fences, feed the horses, clean the rifles. She laughed once when he tried to make sourdough and burned the bottom. He laughed too. At night they sat by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about nothing. She told him about her mother's singing voice. He told her about the dog he had as a boy. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she looked at him across the table. "You never asked for anything in return," she said. "I never will." She reached across and took his calloused hand. But I am giving you something anyway, she said. He looked at her, heart suddenly still. My trust. He held her hand gently. I will never break it, she smiled. It was small but real. The fire crackled behind them. That night she did not sleep in the house. She stayed on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder. Neither of them said a word, but something had shifted. And neither one of them would ever be the same again. By early June, the mesquite began to bloom, and Rhetta had taken to rising before the sun. She would fetch water barefoot, skirts lifted slightly above the dew-slick grass, the pump handle creaking in the morning hush. Vann never rose until she was back inside. He gave her that stretch of solitude without remark, though he always had coffee waiting. One morning, as a hawk curved silent circles above the tree line, she caught him watching her through the window, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever miss the trail?" she asked as she sat across from him, brushing her damp hair back with her fingers. "I miss the silence of it," he said, setting down his cup. But not the sleeping cold or the sound of wolves close by. She traced the edge of her tin cup. "I used to think I'd marry a man who worked cattle, one of the ones who rode past our place, boots dusty, face sunburnt. I would watch from the window and pretend he'd tip his hat to me." Vann didn't smile. "I never tipped my hat to anyone I didn't mean to." She looked up. "Would you have tipped it to me?" "I did more than that." She stood and moved to the doorway. The sky was soft with cloud, the kind that promised a storm by evening. "You don't talk much about what you did before this land." "I was a scout for a time, Fort Concho, then I wasn't." "Why not?" He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "Orders came down that didn't sit right with me. Told me to turn in a Comanche boy who'd surrendered, said the army wanted to make an example. I rode the boy 50 miles west and let him go, left the uniform on the ground behind me." Rhetta looked at him for a long moment. "Did they come after you?" "No. They needed me too much to say it out loud, but I was done all the same." She returned to the table. "You ever see that boy again?" "Once. 2 years later, he was riding with his people north of the Pecos. He saw me and we both just nodded. That was enough." She was quiet a moment. "I used to think the world was made of good and bad, like stories, but it isn't, is it? It's made of people who choose." She nodded slowly. "I want to choose. You already did when you took my hand." That night the rain came, hard, sudden, and thick. The roof held, but the wind howled through the trees like something ancient. Rhetta stood at the door, watching the sky split with lightning. "I can't sleep," she said, not turning around. Vann rose from the hearth. "You want to sit by the fire?" She stepped aside to let him pass. "I want you to tell me something you haven't told anyone." He stared at the flames for a long time. "When I was 15, my brother drowned in the Brazos. He was 2 years older. We'd gone fishing and I dared him to swim out farther. He never came back." She moved closer, the hem of her dress brushing his boot. "You were just a boy. I still hear my mother cry when she found out. There's nothing in this world worse than that sound." Rhetta laid her hand against his forearm. "You carry it with you." "I do." "Same way you carry yours." He looked down at her hand, then met her gaze. "I didn't know if you'd stay," he said. "I didn't either," she answered. He didn't move. She didn't pull away. "I don't want to be someone you saved," she said. "I want to be someone you build with." His voice was low. "Then let's build." She leaned into him, her head finding the space beneath his jaw. His arms wrapped around her like they'd always known how. The wind howled, but inside was still. They stayed like that until the fire was only coals and the rain slowed to a whisper against the shutters. Neither spoke again that night. They didn't need to. By morning, their hands found each other without thought. A new rhythm had begun, quiet but sure, like the first green shoot after winter. By the time the cottonwoods leafed out along the river's bend, Rhetta had begun carving out space in the cabin that wasn't just borrowed. A blue chambray apron hung by the door, stitched by her own hand. A dried strand of prairie sage tucked near the hearth gave off its quiet scent when the fire burned down low. Vann hadn't asked her to stay, not once. But he'd built a table bench wide enough for two, and the second chair at the hearth was always turned toward her. One evening, as dusk thickened and the frogs started up by the creek, Rhetta was bent over a wooden box with a rusted hinge she'd found in the loft. Inside were oil tins, bullet molds, and a bundle of folded letters stained with sweat and time. "These yours?" she asked, holding one up between two fingers. Vann set down the bridle he'd been oiling. "They were my father's. He wrote to my mother from Kansas Territory during the war. She never could read, so she kept them for the paper." Rhetta unfolded one, slow with care. "You ever think of writing anything down?" "I'd rather keep my words where they belong." She smiled faintly. "In your head, in my hands." She folded the letter again, tucking it back. "I used to write poems, just scraps. My mother thought it was foolish." "I don't." She looked over. "You haven't heard one, still don't." She drew her knees up, resting her chin on them. "If I read one, you'd have to promise not to say a thing after." "That's fair." She reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out a square of folded paper, yellowing at the corners. Her voice was soft but steady. "I dreamed the sky was stitched with thread slash and every star a knot, slash, and I pulled the needle through the night slash and tied my name in thought." When she finished, the frogs had quieted, as if listening. He didn't speak. Only looked at her with something close to wonder, and she nodded, satisfied. Next morning, a rider came up the road, his horse foamed and limping. He wore a faded deputy's badge and carried a telegram stained brown from the trail. "Vexley," he said, swinging down. "Heard you've got a good shot and a straight aim. We've got a rancher out near Clear Fork lost his daughter, taken 2 nights ago. Same men that hit that spread near Sweetwater." Rhetta's breath caught. Vann didn't look at her. "You sure they're the same?" Posse saw one of them drop a silver spur. "Same make as the ones left in the ashes back in March." Rhetta stepped forward. "How old's the girl?" 11, maybe 12. She turned to Vann. "You're going?" "I am." She didn't hesitate. "Then I'm going too." The deputy looked between them. "It'll be rough country." "No guarantees." "There never are," Vann said. They rode out that afternoon, sun high and the river behind them. Vann had packed light rifle, water, jerky, and a flask of coffee. Rhetta carried a saddlebag with a needle kit, dried apples, and a folded strip of linen bandage. By nightfall, they'd crossed into the basalt hills north of the Brazos. Coyotes called from the far ridges, and their fire stayed low. Rhetta wrapped her shawl tighter and stirred the embers with a stick. "If we find them and that girl's alive, what then? We bring her home." "And the men," Vann's jaw set. "They don't get another fire." She nodded. "Then, if I hadn't been taken, would you have ever come to Abilene?" "No. You regret it." He glanced at her across the firelight. "No," she let out a breath. "I don't either." He reached across the space between them and touched her hand, not with urgency, but with certainty. "You don't have to prove anything, Rhetta. Coming with me, this isn't yours to carry." She met his gaze, steady. "It is. Because there's another girl out there who's still waiting, and I remember what that wait felt like." The fire cracked. The wind moved through the dry grass. Neither of them said another word. But in the morning, they rode together, side by side, toward the place where the trail grew thin, and justice ran slower than blood. They found the trail by a broken fence post where brush had been crushed and hoofprints cut deep into the clay. From there, they followed a dry creek bed west, the sun dipping behind the hills, shadows long and sharp. Vann rode ahead, rifle across his lap. Rhetta kept pace behind, her eyes flicking over every bent weed, every turned stone. By the second day, the land grew harsher, no trees, just scrub and rocks. They hadn't spoken much since the firelight, but the silence sat easy between them now, like a shared coat in the wind. Near midday, Vann stopped and raised a hand. Rhetta pulled her horse beside his and waited. He pointed to a low rise ahead. Shallow smoke drifted up, barely visible against the sky. "Camp's ahead," he said. 3, maybe 4 men. We go in quiet." She nodded once. "What if the girl's there? We take her first, then I deal with the rest." The descent was slow. Vann signaled for her to stay just behind the rocks while he crept forward. Rhetta crouched low, heartbeat steady. Below, she saw them, 3 men around a cookfire, one sharpening a blade against a boot heel. A 4th figure sat tied beneath a juniper, slight and motionless. Vann moved like he'd done this 100 times. He flanked wide, found his angle, then raised his palm toward Rhetta. She moved when he did, fast and low through the brush. The first man never saw the butt of the rifle before it dropped him. The second reached for his pistol, but Rhetta was already there, rock in hand, splitting his balance with a blow to the temple. The third ran gun halfway out before Vann fired once, clean and low. The man dropped, groaning, leg cut out from under him. Then it was quiet again. The girl under the tree didn't move at first. Her face was streaked with soot, her dress torn at the shoulder. Rhetta knelt beside her and untied the rope. "Your name?" she asked, voice low. The girl blinked, lips cracked. "Eliza, you're safe now." The girl leaned into her without a sound. By nightfall, they had a fire in a dry arroyo, shielded from the wind. Vann had the wounded man tied to a tree with his own belt, mouth gagged. Rhetta tended to Eliza, cleaned her cuts with cool water, and wrapped a strip of linen around her ankle where the rope had rubbed raw. Vann watched from a few feet away, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. "She hasn't spoken since," Rhetta said at last. "She will," Vann replied. "She's got the same look I had back in Abilene." He met her eyes. "You brought her out of it faster than anyone else could have." Rhetta stirred the firewood. "She's young, that helps. You were young. I stopped being young the night they came." Vann set the knife down. "You talk different when you're looking after someone. Maybe I remember how it felt, not knowing who to trust." He nodded once. "You gave her something I couldn't," she glanced over. "What's that?" "A reason to believe a stranger's hand can be safe." They rode back the next morning. Vann carried Eliza in front of him, her thin arms wound tight around his middle. Rhetta rode beside, watching the girl's face for signs of sleep. At the ranch near Clear Fork, a woman with a sun-lined face and straw-colored hair ran out to meet them, bare-footed and breathless. Eliza dropped from the saddle and ran to her without a word. Rhetta turned away as the woman wept into her daughter's neck. Vann walked to her, hat in hand. "You all right?" She nodded but didn't speak. Her jaw was tight. He looked toward the house, then back at her. "You want to leave before they ask too many questions?" "I do." They rode out in silence, the wind soft through the mesquite. A few miles on, Rhetta finally looked over. "You didn't kill the third man." "No. Why?" "I wanted him to sit with the weight of what he did." "Prison walls do that better than a grave." She let out a breath. "I would have shot him." "I know," he said, "and I wouldn't have stopped you." They reached the cabin just before dusk. Rhetta climbed down and paused before heading inside. "Vann," she said, not turning around. "Yeah, I want to plant a garden this spring." He stepped down beside her. "What kind?" "Doesn't matter. I just want to put something in the ground and watch it live." He reached out and touched her back, just lightly, the way one might test a door to make sure it would open. "Then we'll do that," he said. She turned to face him, eyes rimmed red but clear. "And I want to build a bigger table." His hand dropped to his side, but his voice was steady. "I'll cut the planks tomorrow." She took his hand, then no hesitation, no trembling. Just fingers laced through his, firm and warm. Inside, the fire was already catching. She didn't pull away when he followed her in. By late July, the rains had given way to heat that shimmered off the plains and turned the air still. The corral boards had dried to a pale gray, and Rhetta had started plucking burrs from the mule's coat before sunrise to avoid the worst of it. Vann had taken to working shirtless when he split cedar, his broad back darkened by sun and sweat. She didn't comment on it, and he didn't notice her watching, but he moved slower when she was nearby. One afternoon, Rhetta stood inside the cabin, sorting through a crate of seed sacks left by the previous owner. She held up a small linen pouch and read the faded ink aloud. "Cucumbers," she said. Never knew much use for them, but they might take. Vann was carving a handle for a spade near the doorway. "They'll grow fast if the soil stays damp. You'll need to watch the vines. They tangle easy." She looked over her shoulder. "You sound like you've grown them before." "I haven't. But I've seen how stubborn things can be when they want to live." She turned back to the seeds, her mouth twitching once. "That why you stuck around this place?" His knife paused. "No, I stuck around because you did." She didn't say anything at first. Then she set the pouch aside, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out into the light. "Come with me," she said. He followed her past the barn, through a gate he'd repaired last week, and over the rise where the grass still grew tall. At the bottom of the slope, a half-buried stone jutted from the soil. She knelt beside it and began clearing the weeds. "My mother used to talk about land like it was a person," she said. "She'd say some places hold grief better than others, some let it go." The stone had no name, no mark. Just a smooth, flat face worn by years. Rhetta brushed it clean and ran her palm over the surface. "This is where they're buried," she said. I came back here 3 weeks after you brought me out. I didn't say anything because I didn't know how. Vann knelt beside her. You don't owe me that, I know, but I want to tell you now. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a strip of blue cloth, faded but still soft at the edges. It was my mother's kerchief. She wore it every spring when she planted onions. She tied it around the stone, slow and careful, then leaned back on her heels. I'm not afraid of remembering anymore, she said. Not here, not with you. He picked up a small rock beside her and placed it gently at the base of the stone. Then we'll remember together. They walked back in silence, not from distance, but from something settled. That evening, with the sun low behind the hills, Vann brought out a bundle of wood panels from the storage shed. I've been meaning to show you, he said. Thought we might start on the table. She wiped the flour from her hands and stepped outside. He unrolled the canvas. The boards were pale pine, planed smooth, cut to fit in a wide square. Not fancy, but solid. I figured we'd need room for more than two, he said. She looked up, eyes narrowing just slightly. You expecting company? Not exactly, he said. But if we're going to build something that lasts, I think it ought to have space for what's coming. Rhetta studied him for a long moment. Then she reached out and laid her hand on the edge of the timber. I want to marry you, she said. Vann blinked. You do? I do, she said softly. And I want it quiet, no preacher, no papers, just a promise. He stepped closer, his voice rough. I didn't think I'd get to hear that again. Well, you have, she said, lifting her chin. And I'm not saying it twice, so you'd better answer while I'm still in the mood. He took her face in his hands, thumbs rough against her cheekbones, and kissed her like the world had stopped spinning. When he pulled back, there was a rasp to his voice. Yes, he said. I promise. They married at dawn the next day, barefoot in the grass behind the cabin. Vann tied a strip of rawhide around her wrist in place of a ring. She tied his kerchief around his. There were no witnesses but the wind and the birds, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, they planted cucumbers, squash, beans, and a line of sunflowers along the fence. Rhetta painted the inside of the cabin a soft yellow with leftover whitewash and scrap pigment from town. Vann dug a second well just beyond the barn and built a roof for it out of cedar shingles. One evening, deep into August, she came out to where he was mending the fence and held out a folded scrap of cotton. I'll need you to start building a cradle, she said. He stared at her. You sure? She nodded, eyes full and shining. 2 months late and I cry whenever I fry bacon. He let out a breath and pulled her to him, arms full around her middle. You and me, he said. We'll raise them strong. She pressed her ear to his chest. And safe. Years later, the cabin would stand 2 rooms wider with a porch that wrapped halfway around. A dog would sleep beside the door, and 2 boys would chase each other through the rows of sunflowers. Rhetta would laugh when they tracked mud inside. Vann would pretend to scold, then take them out to split kindling just to burn off their noise. Sometimes, when the wind came soft through the cottonwoods, Rhetta would sit at the edge of the garden and write her poems in a small book bound in rawhide. Vann would sit beside her, one hand curled around hers, quiet as ever, content to watch the light shift on her face. And when the nights grew long and the boys were grown, they would lie beside each other listening to the fire pop, the silence between them filled with everything they'd built. A life, a love, a home that had risen from ash and dust, together always.